So, usually in grade 9, we would spend quite a great deal of time looking at art history. And due to the circumstances of that this year, obviously not really going to happen. So, what I wanted to do is just give you a brief overview so that you're ready to understand the art history in grade 10, grade 11, and grade 12. So, in grade 9, we always start with the early Western art history. And when I'm talking about Western, we're actually talking about European. So if we look at a map of the world, here's Europe right here, and down here is Africa. This body of water is the Mediterranean. And most of the early civilizations that we look at in Western art history is all around this area here. So the first sculpture that we're going to look at is found in what is now modern day Germany, right here. When we do architecture, Stonehenge is from England, which is right here. Usually we would have looked at cave art from France, that right here, Spain over here. We won't be doing that in this lesson. We will be focusing right here on Greece. Greece is where the most of the really important early artifacts that we look at is from this area right here. And then we will end with the Roman Empire in grade 9 art history, which this is Italy. You can always just find this piece that looks like it's a boot sticking out into the water. That's Italy. Okay, so in grade 9, we usually talk about two main themes. And one of them is how they made people and how they change over time and how that develops. And that's what this lesson will focus on. And then the next lesson I'll do is the development of architecture. So the first piece that we traditionally look at is this is called the Venus of Willendorf. Lately, the name has changed to the Woman of Willendorf, and it's an early example of what we believe are fertility symbols. So this is from the prehistoric period, and the word prehistoric literally means prehistory. It means there is no documentation of anything from this time. So all we can do is kind of look at stuff that's from that early a time period and go, wonder what's going on here. So when you look at it, you'll notice that there's no face. The head looks like she's wearing a hat or something, or braids are wrapped around her head. And then it's a very stylized sculpture. The female anatomy is very pronounced, and that's because it's believed that this is depicting a pregnant female. Why is this a particular important piece? Because many, many, many sculptures depicting what appears to be female figurines are found all over Europe. So most likely fertility symbols has something to do with procreation. When in art history, why we are looking at it is it's the more famous example. Again, somebody in history chooses this is the one. It gets published into the history of art. It ends up being the famous one. So looking at the female, as I said, the anatomy is fine. The face is not even there. So this is from about over 25,000 years ago. So we move up through time, and this is really early Greek figures, and you'll see how simple the shapes are. So at the beginning of the year, we talked about the difference between organic shapes and geometric shapes, and these are very geometric. And most art, early art from different cultures around the world, tend to have geometric shapes. Even think of like a lot of indigenous Canadian work. Think of masks, think of totem poles, that it's this kind of shapes where you take ovals and you take triangles and you take spheres and you stick them together. So obviously the proportions completely way off, and everything is super simplified. So again, go hundreds and hundreds of years, and we are, again, this is Greek, and this is showing the development of humans. So even though part of her face is missing, if you look at this sculpture, you'll see her facial proportions, at least she's got a face, but they're not correct because the eyes are way up here. And hopefully you know by now that the eyes should be right there. They should be halfway down. The other thing that's happening is, well, unless everyone at that time had dreadlocks, which I'm pretty sure they didn't, the hair is still very geometric. You can see it's all just squares and little triangles at the end. And this period is actually called, like up until now, it's called the geometric period. That's how we can tell. It's by looking. Again, body proportions, not really. Look at the size of her hand. It's ginormous. And of course, she's missing the lower body because it's just tubular. So then we get into the early classical period, and you can tell by the, now this is a young male body. So the proportions are getting better, the anatomy is getting better, it's a lot closer to what we expect it could be. It's still very patterned though. The knee is kind of a little fake looking, but especially when you look up at the head. The Again, looks like they've got dreadlocks because the hair is still from the geometric period. It hasn't developed yet. Same with the face proportions. The eyes are still a little too high up on the head. But what is really important, and why this particular sculpture is one of the more famous ones, is this is when they start to show movement. So up until then, everyone always stood with the two legs together, ever just standing straight. But this one, by putting the one foot in front of the other foot, it's ancient people are trying to illustrate movement. So that leads us up to a later Greek sculpture, and we are almost there. So the anatomy is perfect. These are the proportions of adult male, the shapes, the forms, the proportions, and the body movement is much more natural with stepping forward. However, we still have the whole dreadlock look. So that takes us, again, a couple hundred years, and we hit the high classical period of Greece. So this is known as the Doryphorus. Aren't you glad you don't have an exam and don't have to write that one down? And this is like considered the height of all great sculptures in history. This is called the classical period, and the word classical is one that we use to define, classical music, the greatest, music ever produced, classical writing, oh, the greatest writing. It's the word that we use. It's a specific period of Greek history. So when we look at the Doryphorus, which is just Greek for spear bearer, he not only has his proportions are correct, every detail is correct. So now if you look at his knees, you can kind of tell how fake those early ones were. And he no longer has geometric hair. The hair is now showing much more natural hair. The other thing that's happening is his head is not facing straight out. It is tilted and off to the side. His arms are much more natural. And the really big difference here is called contrapposto. And that means there's a shift in the weight. Like no one really ever stands with their two legs straight unless it's like maybe standing at attention. We almost always bend our one leg. And when you do that, it causes the hips to shift, and that is called contrapposto. So the proportions are correct, the details are correct, and now we have a much more natural body position. And this is a big deal because the Greeks spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years trying to perfect this image of the body. And they were really into perfect human bodies. It doesn't matter how young or how old you were or what kind of condition you were in. If a Greek does a sculpture of you, it will look perfect. Remember, these are the guys that started the Olympics, right? The whole idea of this perfection of sport. The idea is called arete. It's the idea of every time you do something, do it as best as you possibly can. So over hundreds of years, they end up perfecting the depiction of the human body. This is not easy to do. They're not making it out of clay. This is carved from a rock. So then we get, I said, in the classical, they kind of keep going. So this is Nike from the front of the Temple of Nike. And you can always tell Nike because she's got wings. So even though you can't see her head, it used to be right there, there's a wing. And anytime we're looking at Greek art history, if you see a chick with wings, it's Nike. So now what's happening here is, okay, we did the whole perfect body thing. Now let's take it another step. So pose-wise, she's not just, bending a knee, she's lifting her leg, trying to put on the strap of her sandal. So it's a much more distorted body shape. And let's add something else really hard. Let's put wet fabric over top. So not only are we now carving the human body, but they're trying to make this fabric look like it's wet draping fabric. Then the next one, this is considered one of the most famous statues in the history of the world. It is in the Louvre in Paris. And this is Nike Samothrace. Once again, chick with wings, it's Nike. And this is considered like one of the most special sculptures ever made. Obviously, she lost her head because this sculpture was found in the bottom of the ocean as part of a shipwreck, and that's how it got damaged. But once again, we're taking the idea, the human body has been developed. Not only do we have wet fabric, we have wet fabric blowing in the wind. So it's that idea of pushing it, pushing it, pushing it. And the last of the Greek sculptures we will look at is called the Laocoon group. And this is in the very late Greek sculpture, the Hellenistic period. And this is where, okay, we've figured it all out. Now let's get really dramatic. So you can tell if it's a really later sculpture. So this is the story of the father and the two sons. And yeah, there's two snakes. So the one snake, there's his little head right here. And the other snake is, over here biting this guy. And yeah, spoiler alert, they're not going to make it. So this son is already dying, dad's not doing well, and this guy's trying to get out, but the snake's kind of got him trapped. So now you can see that we've got the hair is fully three-dimensional, not just kind of carved over the skull. The faces are really dramatic and starting to show expression. And this is, again, considered one of the greatest sculptures that's ever been created. And I'm just going to show you a detail that I took of a copy of it so you can see how the hair is now three-dimensional. You can see the anguish on his face. The Greeks perfected this idea of depiction of people. The last period that we look at in grade 9 art history is the Roman Empire. And what happens is Rome takes over Greece. So they just kind of take the sculptors and say, hey, you work for us now. So it's not like they invent anything new. So the Greek sculptors are still working on all the artwork. And here's an example of a Roman sculpture. So art always shows what's important at the time. So when we were looking at the Greek sculptures, they were Nike, they were, Laocoon group. Those are all mythological stories. And of course, mythology is like the religion of the Greeks at that time in history. That's what's important. That's what you make sculptures of. When you get to the Romans, it's all about the army. That's what the Romans are into. So when you are doing sculptures of the Roman army, and here's Caesar, the most famous of all the generals, yeah, you don't want him looking young and pretty and 20, right? Because that's not scary, and that's not what he looked like. So the big difference from the Romans, from the Greeks, is while the Greeks were all about making everyone look perfect in this ideal body form, the Romans would make people look how they actually looked. So again, you don't want Caesar looking all pretty. You want him looking mean. Look at his eyebrows. Look at the furrow on his brow, right? You want him to be scary. And same thing, you want to show his age in his portrait because he has deserved the honors of being the greatest general in history over time. Okay, so that's just a kind of brief little summary of how people were shown from prehistoric time till the Roman Empire.